Hello, and welcome back to Building New Music. In this part, we'll discuss the planning and sketching stage, creating the blocks that your piece will be built on. To begin with, let me clarify. You don't have to plan before writing. Some composers don't plan at all, or perhaps more accurately, plan as they write their piece. And you don't need to bother writing anything down. It can often be hard to put things down in words. But, for the purposes of this video, I'll be writing my plan in detail as I go. And knowing how to make plans is useful even if you're entirely through composing. I would encourage people to experiment with different levels of planning so you can see which way works best for you. And from there, develop better music. To start with, look closely at your initial idea stage. To recap, my idea was a piece using silence as a building block for a wind quartet. It's all well and good to have this down, but to build a full piece out of this, you need to know exactly what this means over the course of the piece. It's vitally important, in my opinion, to have an idea of the duration before you start this process. This way, you'll be able to get an understanding of the pacing of the piece and plan accordingly. A piece can be any duration, though do note that longer pieces will require a significantly different approach to shorter pieces. For this piece, I decided to aim for a 5-minute duration. This won't always be a concrete plan, and I may end up over or undershooting this mark, but it will make your life easier. Your idea, as we discussed before, is something that's central to the piece, but that doesn't mean it has to be static. As you're probably already aware, development of ideas is a cornerstone of most music. Explore the musical space provided by your idea. A musical phrase can be varied in so many different ways. Timbres can be built into and out of gradually. A harmonic structure necessarily features development. Unless your piece is specifically built around stasis, your ideas should develop, and knowing how to do that is key to going forward. Having this development in mind at the centre of your plan is important in my opinion, as it provides the basis from which to build various aspects of a piece around, and a clear set of goals for you to write towards. In my case, I considered different meanings of musical silence and different ways to vary its relationship with sound. I considered both gradual developments into and out of silence, and sudden developments from it. I also explored related concepts, such as air tones that exist in between sound and silence. During this process, I decided on what would be central to my piece. My primary goal would be to vary the rhythm in which silence emerges, either rhythmic and tightly controlled, or elongated and unpredictable. Having the central plan in mind also allows you and others to ask various questions about it. I would recommend discussing plans with other composers, seeing if they have any second opinions, and if they can recommend existing pieces which reflect this in interesting ways. By referencing other pieces, you can find new ideas and compare your concepts to what already exists, helping build your understanding of them. And by letting other composers and musicians question you, you can answer important questions, expose potential holes in your plans, and work towards developing your ideas better. I also considered secondary developments. I developed a system for which to base my harmonic language, which is something I've used in previous pieces, which is complicated enough that I won't go into it here. I also explored many of the timbral possibilities of my ensemble, in order to see what might best complement the piece. Not every parameter has to be tightly planned, of course. It's rare to write a piece with no intuitively written aspects at all. While I do have a general idea of how the rhythms of this piece will develop, I've elected not to pre-plan these, and let them emerge spontaneously. The exact shape of gestures within the piece will also be left to develop spontaneously. Leaving yourself room to find new things while writing is just as important as knowing what you're going to write beforehand. If everything is rigidly planned, it can often be difficult to deviate from said plans, and you may find while writing that aspects of the piece ended up being unexpectedly interesting in ways that demand development. We'll talk more about this in a later part. However, what I didn't know at this point was how these ideas stack together and form the texture. Without a good impression of how something sounds, it can be difficult to get a proper idea of how it should be developed, which is where the next step comes in, sketching. You don't need much to sketch, essentially just whatever you can write music on. Personally, I prefer to sketch on paper if I have the time for it, so I did that for this piece. I recommend all composers try writing on paper sometimes, even if just as an exercise. I like to think of sketching as writing without shame. This is usually where I rely most on instinct. You don't have to think about exactly how your sketches work within the piece as a whole. Many composers sketch simply to build palettes of sound to work with, or as rough versions of specific points in the piece. You can use sketches as building blocks to insert directly into your piece, but this isn't required. You can sketch as much or as little as you want, as long as when you start writing, you're comfortable with what you have. There's also a few tricks I like to do while sketching to ease the burden on myself. For example, if I want something that feels truly spontaneous and free-flowing, I'll write without a time signature and simply add one when I'm writing it up if I feel it's necessary. If I want a certain technique, I won't bother thinking about what the correct notation is, I'll just write it out in words. And oftentimes in sketches, I won't be thinking about practicality, I'll just write what I want to hear. And if I find that it's overly impractical, I can make changes while writing. Some people don't bother with certain parameters while making sketches. Some simply sketch rhythms or harmonic structures individually. The only thing that's necessary for your sketches is for you to find them helpful. For this piece, I ended up writing 2 sketches, which I'll show you now. If you can read my awful handwriting, you can see a texture emerging, insisting precisely timed hits onto soprano sax and flutes, along with rhythmic figures separated by silences on tenor and baritone saxophones. I was happy with many of the textures shown here, but not with the structure. There are many notes about structural and pacing concerns that I wrote on the page, and more that I noted on my own. I ended up dropping the 5/16 bars, finding them more difficult than necessary. Reflecting on sketches and iterating on plans is very important. For example, this first sketch was intended to be the start of the piece, but I decided that it wouldn't make much sense. This wasn't close enough to either extreme of smoothness or rigidity that I decided was important for my piece, and failed to properly establish this dichotomy clearly, so developments from this wouldn't make much sense. So I worked on a second sketch, this time as the start of the piece, intending this to be the opposite end of the spectrum to the other. Comparatively, this sketch was kept a lot closer to the final piece, but there are still a number of changes made. This sketch exhibits a much smoother texture, with the relationship between silence and sound being muddled. I used extremes of dynamics to complicate the relationship between sound and silence, and tried to give it a spontaneous feel. These sketches were an important part of the writing process, giving me a very strong impression of how the piece was going to sound, how it might be shaped, and what will be important. Sketches and plans don't have to be done one after the other. Plans can come from sketches and vice versa, and in this piece I made a number of iterations to the plan after making these sketches. I decided to more strongly bring out the movement from one texture to the other as a linear process, and I decided to include a midpoint that acts as a peak of spontaneity and timbral noise, while also calcifying the relationship between sound and silence from smoothness to rigidity. I decided I would let this texture develop while writing the piece. Again, not everything has to be sketched. This process can be extensive or as short as you feel is necessary. Generally, the more that's tightly planned, the less time it will take to write. I tend to strike a happy medium between planning and through composing, but both methods are valid. It's also important at this stage to ascertain what's possible for your ensemble, either within the capabilities of the players or the instruments as a whole. If you're trying difficult or unique techniques, it helps to ask performers questions beforehand. In my case, I was wondering about the saxophone's highest register and what my players were capable of, so I asked my performers about it. It turned out that my sketches far exceeded the highest comfortable ranges for alto sax, so I shifted things around in the final piece. You can't know everything about every instrument, so make sure you ask people who do. These types of questions will also come up during the writing process, so always remember to ask someone if you're unsure of anything. Once I was done with this process, I felt confident that I had enough to move on to writing the piece in proper, and we'll get to that next time, but until then, thank you for watching.